Chris, you were telling me just a few minutes ago that it's been 6 months to the day since the Lord took R.C. home to be with him. Really appropriate that we're here together. We're so thankful for our friends at Ligonier Ministries who have co-hosted this meal with us today, and the connections between RTS and RC and Ligonier go way back. And there are many of those personal connections manifested in the room. I was reminded, looking at the By Faith article, about our new moderator, that our new moderator became acquainted with the Reformed faith through Ligonier Ministries, Renewing Your Mind, Table Talk, and then came to RTS in Washington, D.C., where he completed his master's in studies in preparation for the gospel ministry in the PCA. And I could tell that story over and over again about Presbyterian and Reformed ministers that I meet all over the world. So we're very thankful for our partners at Ligonier, and I'm glad to be with the president of Ligonier, Chris Larson, who's a dear friend, longtime friend. Chris and I, we've known one another since way back in Greenville, South Carolina. And then Burk Parsons, who pastors at St. Andrews in Orlando and is an RTS Orlando grad, teaches for us at RTS, serves in Ligonier, has edited Table Talk in times past. And we just wanted to reflect for a few minutes today on the legacy of R.C. Sproul. And Chris, I thought I'd start with you. You've been at Ligonier for how long now?
14 years.
And had the joy of serving a lot of different functions at Ligonier even before you became the president. Tell me a little bit about your personal relationship with RC and the responsibilities that you have, but the friendship that you have with RC.
So we'd meet on Wednesdays for lunch, and we would talk about ministry, but it usually started with him asking how my golf swing was, or he'd ask about one of my children. He'd always want to know what was happening with the different things going on in our family. And then just whatever was on his mind that day. And we would just connect, and that went on for a good decade, getting together with him. And Burk would meet with him on a separate day of the week and talk mainly about church matters.
Yeah, and Burk, you pastored a church with RC. So what's it like pastoring a church with RC Sproul?
I don't think we have enough time today. In fact, I remember it was the last GA when we were here in Atlanta, whenever that was. I forget what year that was. I had preached the Sunday before, and we were always sort of preaching together. And when he was gone, of course, I was preaching. But this is years ago. And I saw him at the cafe, at the restaurant upstairs. And he showed me his watch. He said, "What time is it?" And I told him what time it was. He said, "Good, you can read my clock. Next time, don't go over a minute in your sermon." So the truth of the matter is that, you know, we know RC to be so strong and so bold, yet those of us who knew him well also knew how gracious and how humble he was. Our situation at St. Andrews would never have worked if he were not the humble and gracious man and forgiving lots of my shortcomings.
But he was always, R.C. was always looking for that teachable moment with young ministers. He did that to me. I spoke at a Ligonier conference many years ago, and he came up to me afterwards. First thing he says is, "Ligon, you know how many times you looked down at your notes and broke eye contact with the audience?" I counted 73 times. So he doesn't care whether you're a professor at a seminary or whatever. He's going to help. But I love those kinds of interactions with RC. He was always looking for a teachable moment. And let me believe you can tell from my story, I've thought about that a lot over the last 20 years, and it's impacted the way that I try and communicate with people. And so I think we could all probably tell RC stories like that.
He was just all in every moment. All in. And he would always just be trying to find out, what are we doing next? Yeah. He never looked in the rearview mirror for very long. We'd come off a conference, and maybe it was a very successful conference or a very successful outreach. RC, we did this thing down at the Olympics in Brazil, and I tell him about the results, and that was great. And the next question was, what's next?
What's next?
Yeah, there was never this sense of looking in the rearview mirror and coasting. He wanted to know what are we doing next? And he was just had this energy that I've seen in very few people.
Yeah. And, it was also a joy to see his marriage. RC and Vesta loved one another. And I've had the privilege of knowing a lot of my heroes who didn't have marriages like that. And so it was just a joy for me to see a hero in the faith who loved his wife like crazy, and she loved him. And like you say, to the very end, had joy and energy in what he was doing. I've seen guys that lost the fire, and not that man. That he to the end, he wanted to die in his boots, and he did. And that's an encouragement for me. I'm at the age now where I'm thinking about crossing the finish line, and making the last push and sprint to that line. And having a guy like RC out there who did it well is a real encouragement to me. I think a lot of you will know the connection between RTS and RC over the years. RC came to teach at RTS in Jackson many years ago. By the way, that's where some of you in this room will remember, because you were in a class where he would ask a student to open up the class in prayer, and then he would proceed to a theological critique of their prayer. And it so terrified the young men in class that one day he asked a guy to pray, and the guy stood up and he said, "Let us pray. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." and then he sat down and he said, "Critique that, Dr. Sproul." So again, that's that teachable moment thing. But he was in Jackson, and then was one of the founding professors at RTS in Orlando. He's taught in the D-Min program for RTS over time. And Ligonier has been so wonderful to use so many of RTS's professors in your publications, in media. We're going to do some giveaways today. One of the giveaways will be Guy Waters' book, which Ligonier produced on the life and theology of Paul, Derek Thomas, Sinclair Ferguson. I can go down the list, Guy Richard, of our RTS folks that write for Ligonier. So this partnership is I'm always looking for ways to extend the influence of my faculty members. And Ligonier has so helped us do that at a popular level. And I think Reformed guys forget that level a lot of the time.
Yeah, Ligonier has a broad outreach that's trans-denominational, but at our core, we're Westminsterian, and that's where our heart beats. And so when you look around, it's got to be the RTS faculty that you're going to time and time again for kind of addressing the issues that are facing the church.
Tell us, Chris, a little bit what you're planning, because we're in a world without RC now. And what's next for Ligonier? In the spirit of RC, what's next? What are you trying to do in the short term and the long term at Ligonier?
In one sense, nothing has changed at Ligonier. Everything has changed at the same time. We miss RC. But he had a generosity of spirit that we've been working on succession planning for a dozen years. And so there was no sense of panic. And one of the greatest gifts that he gave, and perhaps this is instructive for all of us as we think about how do we pass along our work to others, it's a testimony to that planning and RC's foresight and his kind of giving of himself to say, this is bigger than me, this is not about me, such that after RC went to be with the Lord, there was no sense of panic among the staff. We knew what we were to be about. And we were continuing with the same plans that we had been discussing with RC and with others for many years and months. And so I think that's one of the greatest things that he gave us as a leader, not just this body of work that we can continue to introduce new people to, but just that there was an organizational structure that knew why it existed. And we had a founding purpose that hasn't wavered. So we're looking increasingly internationally and finding a lot of fruitful work being done internationally. South America, good things happening in Africa. I think altogether we can realize that together as a church, we've got a big project in front of us when it comes to Europe and the fact that we've got to replant Europe. And so I think all of us kind of recognize that we need one another. Ligonier with this popular approach to Reformed theology, and then with RTS and the trained ministry that we want to lift up and see supported.
That's great. Burk, how did you come to know RC and to know of RC's ministry?
I was on staff at Sarasota Baptist Church in Sarasota, Florida. And it was there we had some folks that would go to Ligonier conferences. And then starting in college, a friend gave me a copy of Table Talk and so on and so forth. Yeah. So started about 1995 when I was on staff at that church. And then went to college and then finished and went right on to RTS Orlando. So.
Wow. And tell me, just like I asked about Ligonier, what's next for St. Andrews as you lead that church, by God's grace, into the future?
Thank you, Lig. Really, we're just trying to stay the course.
Yeah.
And not do anything different. And the reality of it is that, I've been there at St. Andrews since 2001, at Ligonier since 99. And everything that we do as a church, everything that we're about, our worship, our style, Donnie and your wife and family attended years ago, and it's not changed. And we're not planning on changing anything. So it just staying the course. Continue to preach through Romans in the morning and Exodus in the evening, and just continue to do ordinary means of grace ministry as you taught me.
Amen.
So.
Well, by the way, your story is so, again, I could tell that story over and over again. In fact, almost 10 years ago, Erwin Ince, our moderator, introduced me to a young man named Brian Crawford, who I should have known. He was only 40 miles from me, but he introduced me to this young man at the Gospel Coalition Conference in Chicago in 2009. And this young man had come out of a Word of Faith background. In fact, he and his father pastored a health and wealth gospel Pentecostal church in the fields of Tallulah, Louisiana. And he had been introduced to the Reformed faith through R.C. Sproul and Ligonier Ministries. And he and his father had changed that church from a Word of Faith church to a Reformed church. Now, that's pretty impressive. And it started with Brian's introduction to R.C. and Ligonier Ministries and the resources from there.
I think one of the most significant things that you were mentioning and Chris was mentioning is that, RC and Table Talk, Renewing Your Mind conferences, books, the things that we publish, they're meant to get the word out, get the gospel out to the nations. But we don't believe we're the be-all, end-all. We're trying to get people to read Guy Richard's new book on baptism, to read your other guy's book on Paul, to go deeper. And so we're trying to
It's kind of a requirement. You have to be named Guy to work for RTS.
So we're trying to whet their appetites. That's why in Table Talk we're always giving them further resources. We want them to go deeper because we can't do that for everyone. But your professors can, and other leaders can. They can lead them down that path. So.
Thank you, men. It's been a joy to talk with you today. Thank you so much.